Welcome to History 111, Lecture 7, Colonial Society. The majority of the colonial population was from lower class background or sometimes the younger sons of middle or upper class families who had no real prospect for inheritance. Now, a number of people became indentured servants, and a lot of male indentured servants left service with limited prospects and often were no better off than when they had started. Do realize that not all indentured servants were volunteers, and sometimes prisoners were used in that way. Now, in the South anyway, the majority of the population was male, particularly in Virginia. Now, women there could marry at the end of their service quite often. Now, within those places, as a result, though, there's a large roaming free male population who have no land and have nothing to tie them down. And even if they do get married, they're still going to need to move from place to place looking for work, and that's going to breed social unrest within the colony of Virginia. Now, the English population back home, their growth is slowing, and increased prosperity in England is going to ease population pressure there. And indentured servants are going to tend to become scarce after 1670, and those who become indentured servants tend to move to mid Atlantic colonies where conditions are better, so that's going to really slow the number of indentured servants moving into the South. Medicine within the colonies was tend to be pretty primitive and based on assumptions rather than science. Within the colonies, doctors were scarce, and that led to a lot of opportunities for women to become midwives and become local healers that people would go to for medical treatment. Women in the South, as we're going to see, are going to live a very different life than their northern counterparts. Within the South, few families remain intact. Families don't always immigrate together, and the indentured servant system is going to leave a lot of people without land and therefore without permanent ties. People are going to roam the colonies looking for work, and that's going to tend to break up families over time. And what this means is that women within the South can become more independent. Their male relatives were often nowhere around, and this means that they can freely choose their husband. In addition, there were a relatively small number of women. That meant they had a lot of choice in terms of who they could marry, and that tended to work to their advantage. In addition, premarital sex was widespread in the South, and about one-third of all marriages occurred with the bride already pregnant. Churches also exert a lot less control over daily life in the South than what we're going to see in the North, and women also tend to remarry in the South very quickly if they're widowed. And again, that has to do with the real skew, whether it's so many men compared to the number of women. And family structure within the South, as a result, is extremely complicated. Now, within the North, there's a lot less choice for women, and there's a lot of factors that lead to that. The ratio of male to female, first of all, was more equal, and families tend to stay together. In addition, churches tend to exert high levels of social control over daily life, and there's a higher life expectancy in the North. And that means that fathers live longer. And by controlling property and marriage, fathers can exert a lot of control over both their male and female children well into adulthood. There's also going to be a lot more people moving into the colonies at this stage. Now, the South is dependent on labor-intensive cash crops, while the North intends to engage in food production and export of natural resources. And what that's going to mean is that slavery is present in all colonies, but the shortage of indentured servants within the South is going to lead to an increase in the import of slaves. As slaves were initially treated like indentured servants and eventually released, however, the growing demand for labor is going to quickly lead to this status becoming permanent and hereditary. In addition, back in Europe, there's a lot of religious unrest and widespread intolerance, as well as wars of religion, and that's going to lead to large waves of immigrants coming from the European continent to England's North American colonies. When you factor that in, along with slavery and the natural growth, what you see is the non-native population of the English colonies is doubling every 25 years. When it comes to economics, the South is dependent on labor. And in the South, there's a tendency to try to enlarge plantations because people at the time believe that the way you make more money is by producing more stuff. They don't really understand supply and demand, so sometimes they're actually flooding the market and driving prices down and actually being counterproductive. But in their mind, bigger is better. And that's going to mean that they need a lot more laborers. And the harsh, dangerous conditions are going to mean that laborers are going to refuse to perform work, and that's going to further entrench slavery within the South. On the North, on the other hand, they're growing food and they're exporting raw materials. They're not dependent on what they see as cheap labor. So raw materials are going to be exported back to England, and they're going to ship back manufactured goods, and that really should be understood in terms of mercantilism. So we have a very different economy up there. And one of the key differences that emerges between North and South is the emergence of the plantation system. And that plantation system is really almost exclusive to the southern colonies. And These plantations tend to be self contained communities, and there's a lack of towns in the South as a result. In small plantations, everyone's going to live and work together, while in large plantations, they can be very highly stratified society, and slavery is going to lead to complex, unstable family life for slaves, and resistance is present even from the beginning, and is often very complex and often takes passive forms like breaking tools or working slowly. By contrast, the Puritan communities are built around villages and not around isolated plantations far from each other. These villages put a lot of people in close proximity around agricultural land known as the commons, so there's a large open grazing field with all these houses side by side. So in the south, you might live miles from your neighbors. Here, you live feet. And what this means is since everybody is in such close proximity, there's a huge amount of social pressure to conform, and those who don't fit in were subject to harsh measures. And the most famous and also most extreme example of that will be the Salem witch trials. And realize that within Puritan society, the fathers, selectmen, ministers, and all the other important town officials are going to wield huge power over those under them. Whereas in the South, people are sort of isolated. As a result, it's a very different social structure. Now, in both North and South, cities are going to begin to grow up as trading ports and they're going to expand. Cities are also going to be highly unstable due to chaotic trade and they're going to have cycles of boom and bust, periods where they do really well, and then periods where the towns almost dry up and disappear. And the beginnings of industry are going to occur in some cities, but there's going to be no major industrialization because of a poor transport network, irregular production, and also there are laws against the manufacture of goods that will compete with England, and you should understand those laws within the context of mercantilism. Do realize that most colonists were not self sufficient? They often had limited tools and had to trade for necessities and often just scrape by. In the colonies as well, there was a shortage of hard currency, and that's going to lead to a complex barter system. And the economy is going to become chaotic, and goods production is far from dependable. Those who do prosper, however, are going to spend large sums of money importing household goods as status symbols from England. And again, understand that in terms of mercantilism. So what's the big idea here? Well, first and foremost, when it comes to North versus South, know what's going on with women and know the plantation system and the village system and what they imply about the societies. Also know that there's some growth in trade ports, but really the major pattern is a chaotic economy. See you in the next lecture.